Persia, known today as Iran, is home to one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth and is considered one of the first great empires. When Islam swept through the region, Persia emerged as a center of the Islamic Golden Age, contributing significant culture, scholarship, and science to the world. But by the appearance of the Bab in the 19th century, Persia was in serious decline.
They were suffering from a military defeat against Russia, so they were suffering economically. Poverty was widespread.
The wars had been supported by the clerics, stating that it was incumbent upon them as a religious responsibility to engage in battle against these atheists from Russia. Naturally, it was expected that they would be victorious because they were fighting on the side of God. When they were not, when they suffered defeat, it was humiliating.
There was anarchy in parts of the country. And on the other hand, you had power-hungry religious clerics that were challenging the state's authority. And the ordinary people were sort of crushed in between these two powers.
It was a depressing condition of a country that once upon a time was great and now was brought down very low.
It was in this environment that Sayyid Ali Muhammad, who would become known as the Bab, was born on October 20th, 1819, in Shiraz, Persia. He was a descendant of Abraham, and he was also a descendant of Muhammad, which gave him revered status in society. After his father died at a young age, he was raised by his mother and his uncle.
He was receiving an education, but the teacher told his uncle that he didn't need to go to school to receive an education because he seemed to have such innate knowledge.
At the age of 15, the Bab went to work in his uncle's textile business in the port city of Bushehr.
He was known for his honesty. He was known for his spirituality. He spent lots of time in prayer.
When he was 20, he traveled to Karbala, Iraq, a city held sacred by Shia Muslims.
At this time, Karbala is the center of the highest intellectual developments in the world of Shia Islam, which was the Shaykhi movement.
The Bab met a number of these disciples of Sayyid Kazem. And the Bab, in fact, sat on some of Sayyid Kazem's classes.
The Bab's time in Karbala lasted less than a year, after which he returned to Shiraz. There, he soon married his childhood friend, Khadija Begum. Late one night, after noticing that the Bab had left their bed, she went looking for him and saw the upper chamber of their house was immersed in light. She later wrote, "His face was luminous, rays of light radiated from it. He looked so majestic and resplendent that fear seized me, and I stood transfixed where I was." The next morning, the Bab confirmed that she had witnessed his actual moment of revelation. He told her, "It was the will of God that you should have seen me in the way you did last night, so that no shadow of doubt should ever cross your mind." All major religions have prophecies of a promised one who will usher in a golden age. The Messiah, the return of Christ, the 10th Avatar, and the 12th Imam. Today, many have put aside these prophecies, never imagining that they could come true, especially in their own lifetime. But this was not always so. Less than 200 years ago, people all over the world experienced an intense and immediate expectation of a promised one. Major world religions, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were each independently identifying the same time period, the mid-19th century, for the appearance of their promised one. In England, France, Germany, Holland, Sweden, and other countries, Christians were actively waiting to receive the fulfillment of prophecies that they were convinced were imminent. At that time, a man named William Miller became convinced that the second coming, or second advent of Jesus Christ, could be calculated to the day and set out to prove it.
William Miller went through the Bible meticulously, and he matched historic events that had already happened with prophecies in both the Old and the New Testaments. And to his great surprise, he discovered, first of all, the first advent was there, prophesied in the Old Testament, and then that the second advent was coming.
He compared the prophecies with actual historical events that seemed to fulfill prophetic promises, and computed very rationally the date when all the prophecies would be fulfilled.
Thousands of people believed that Miller was right and flocked to what became the American Adventist movement, convinced that Jesus Christ would return on a specific day in 1844.
One can imagine the heightened expectation of people, both the excitement and the fear of what was coming.
The farmers stopped farming their fields. They didn't do the harvest.
Some people confessed to crimes so that they wouldn't have the crimes on their conscience when Jesus came.
People who drank gave up alcohol. People really changed the way of living, ready for this fantastic moment.
On October 22nd, 1844, 100,000 followers gathered together in churches, homes, and fields in anticipation of the promised arrival of Jesus Christ.
When the sun came up on October 23rd, they had to confess to themselves that nothing happened.
It was terrible. It was really terrible. They were completely distraught and weeping.
The day became known around the world as the Great Disappointment.
What I find fascinating is that a similar thing was happening in Persia amongst the Shia Muslims. And extraordinarily enough, the year that they were looking at in their calendar was 1260, which is 1844 in our calendar.
While Christians in the West were awaiting the return of Christ in 1844, at the same time in the East, Shia Muslims also awaited a divine messenger under a different name, the 12th Imam.
They believe that he was in a state of physical concealment. He was alive and present, but he simply could not be seen.
They imagined that this 1,000-year-old person would return to the world as an agent of God to bring peace. That he would use the sword to become a political leader and rule over the world with justice.
Every Shi'i in mid-19th century Iran, of course, had to believe this. Some of them perhaps hoped it would never happen because it would be a great shakeup, according to the prophecies in the Shi'i holy books. Things would be turned upside down. It wouldn't be business as usual when the hidden Imam comes back. Yes, justice would be established, but many things would change.
The Orthodox religious and political leaders of Persia, while they paid lip service to the longed-for advent of the 12th Imam, they well knew that his arrival would signal the end of their power. Sayyid Kazem had told Mullah Hussein that he would know the Promised One when he delivered, without being asked to do so, a commentary on a chapter of the Quran known as the Surah of Joseph.
As if by a magnet, Mullah Hussein says, he is attracted to the city of Shiraz.
And there, in Shiraz, something happened that would reverberate across the world. Mullah Hussein arrived on May 22, 1844, and soon noticed a striking young man who wore a green turban, signifying sacred lineage as a descendant of Muhammad.
This young man approached him and greeted him so warmly with such courtesy and such dignity, and asked him if he would be a guest in his home.
Mullah Hussein was surprised, but accepted the young man's invitation.
The young man asks Mullah Hussein, in what way did your master, Sayyid Kazem, describe the Promised One? The Promised One would be between the ages of 20 and 30. He would be of pure lineage, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. He would be completely bereft of any bodily deficiencies, and he would possess innate knowledge.
The youth listened to Mullah Hussein's description of the Promised One, and then he said, "Behold, all these signs are manifest in me."
Mullah Hussein was somewhat taken aback by this. He was a young man who wasn't even one of the learned class. He was a merchant, and yet he was making these claims.
He's faced with this dilemma. Could this be? But there was a hesitation because of how weighty this responsibility was, and he began to remember all the things that his teacher had told him about the magnificence, the power, the knowledge of this individual.
Then, without being prompted, the youth asserted, "Now is the time to reveal the commentary on the Surah of Joseph." This was the definitive sign Mullah Hussein was waiting for.
That it would come from someone who is not trained in the religious sciences and come so automatically like that, out of the blue, must have been overwhelming.
Thrilled by the beauty and rapidity of his revelation, Mullah Hussein listened as the youth declared that he was the Bab, meaning the gate, sent by God to usher in a new age for mankind and herald another prophet even greater than he.
This was an astounding moment for Mullah Hussein, who found himself realizing that he was indeed in the presence of the Promised One.
During the summer of 1844, 17 more people became the first followers of the Bab. In many ways, these followers were like the 12 apostles of Christ. Prominent among them was the youngest disciple, Qudus.
And these were individuals that needed to discover the Bab on their own through the purity of their own hearts and their own intentions.
And so that itself was a very intriguing and mysterious process, guided by spiritual intuition and a sincere desire for spiritual search on behalf of all of those individuals and many, many more.
The original disciples of the Bab were called the Letters of the Living. This symbolized the building blocks to the new revelation, that these letters went out and they promoted the word of the living God.
The Bab dispatched his disciples throughout Persia and Iraq to proclaim the coming of the new revelation. The people were expecting the return of the 12th Imam, but the message delivered by him was radically different. The message they spread was that all people and all things come from the same Creator and are sacred, beautiful, and worthy of respect. It didn't matter if you were a king or a goat herder in the eyes of God. External traits such as race, gender, and nationality are not the true human reality. Instead, each of us are like mirrors reflecting the light of God's revelation.
According to Shia Islam, the 12th Imam would actually go on pilgrimage to Mecca, and during that pilgrimage, he would then announce his new revelation.
Pilgrims circle the sacred Kaaba 7 times, speaking the words, "Here I am, O Lord, here I am." The Bab did much more. Grasping the ring on the venerable shrine, he cried out to the encircling crowd, "I am that promised one whose advent you have been awaiting." Then he said it again, "I am that promised one whose advent you have been awaiting." And finally, "I am that promised one whose advent you have been awaiting."
Unfortunately, his proclamation was met with deaf ears. It was not acknowledged.
The Bab then proclaimed his revelation in a letter to the Sharif, the highest-ranking religious leader of Mecca. He and his message were ignored. Despite being officially ignored at Mecca, the Bab's proclamation shook the very core of traditional beliefs, and this could not be ignored in Persia.
It was politically disruptive to the clerics at that time to have a new religion appear and have beliefs like individual investigation of truth, which means that people hearing their sermons wouldn't simply believe them because they said so, but now have a spiritual obligation to independently read holy texts for themselves and make spiritual decisions using their own conscience.
When Qudus and other Babis publicly proclaimed the advent of the Bab, they were shaved, pierced, and paraded through the streets in humiliation, and then exiled. In Shiraz, the governor, Hussein Khan, called for the Bab's arrest as soon as he returned from his pilgrimage. People from all over the kingdom began flocking to Shiraz to learn more about his teachings, hoping, praying for an opportunity to meet the Bab himself. The king of Persia, known as the Shah, was finally forced to pay attention. Proceeding cautiously, he sent Vahid, his most trusted scholar, to investigate the cause of the Bab.
Vahid is well known for his knowledge. He was famous for having memorized 20,000 traditions of the Prophet and of the Imams.
Vahid made a solemn vow. If he found the Bab to be false, he would strike him down with the Shah's sword. If he found the Bab to be true, he would lay down his own life for him.
And so Vahid came to Shiraz and set up an interview with the Bab. Initially, he was very arrogant. He considered himself infinitely superior to the Bab. But as the Bab started to reply to his questions and reveal the true extent of his own spiritual understanding, Vahid became more and more reflective and started thinking, I've underestimated this person.
Vahid held a chapter of the Quran in his mind that without being asked to do so, the Bab would elucidate. And to his astonishment and shock, the Bab spontaneously delivered a commentary on that exact section. For the next 5 hours, he freely revealed the Word of God without interruption or hesitation.
Vahid was so won over by his experience with the Bab that he actually wrote the Shah and told the Shah that any of the disparaging comments that had been made about the Bab were absolutely false. And finally, he said, I myself am now a follower of the Bab.
When the Shah received the message of his most trusted scholar, he reportedly told his prime minister, if Vahid is a Babi, we should stop belittling the cause of the Bab.
However, the prime minister served in a sense as the Shah's spiritual guide. And Prime Minister Aghasi was very threatened by the claim of the Bab to being the promised one.
And so the Shah's specific wishes were ignored, and Hussein Khan ordered that any person in Shiraz found in possession of the Bab's writings would face severe punishment. Yet the curious and the scholarly continued to seek out the Bab and his teachings, risking everything to meet him in person. In the summer of 1850, the Prime Minister of Persia ordered that the Bab be brought to Tabriz for public execution by firing squad.
Along with the Bab was his companion, a young man by the name of Anis, who had asked to be with the Bab and to face the soldiers during this execution.
As the Bab was suspended for a second time against the pillar with Anis, he spoke his final words to the multitude. Had you believed in me, O wayward generation, every one of you would have followed the example of this youth. The day will come when you will have recognized me. That day I shall have ceased to be with you.
At that point, the command was given again for the soldiers to shoot, and the Bab and his companion were executed.
Mi bien amado, el deseo de mi corazón.